Hello everybody and welcome to another Panelino Bambino tier list video. Today we're going to be looking at Radiant Dawn. So this is an interesting game as opposed to the other games I've done because there is a lot to this game. And if you've ever played it, then you're probably fully aware of this. There are a lot of characters in the game, and there are also different sections in the game. So as far as doing a complete tier list of the entire game is concerned, not only would it be enormous, but I think it's really hard to compare units from different parts. Not impossible, for sure. What I've decided to do is basically break it up into chunks. So today we're going to be doing a tier list where we're going to look at the Dawn Brigade chapters. So that's the first section of the game, and then there are 3 chapters in part 3 that include the Dawn Brigade. I'm not going to be looking at once you sort of have them together in the final part of the game or anything like that. I don't think that's as important, and that won't really affect any like placements and stuff like that. Just the first part, and then those 3 chapters in part 3. And then I plan on doing probably the other parts of the game, tier list for them, and then maybe we'll try to bring it all together. I'm not really sure yet. But yeah, we're going to start here. I'll just, some ground rules as always with my tier list. We're going to be looking at this game through the context of maniac modes. That's the hardest mode you can play on, and on Iron Man, which obviously means that if characters die, you just keep going, and if a lord dies or you game over for any reason, you start the game over. Radiant Dawn is actually a little bit interesting. Not that this is going to affect the tier list, but early on is actually very difficult because most units can't die, and if they do, you just game over. So most of the time in these games, like, if an early unit dies, it sucks, but whatever, you keep moving. In Radiant Dawn, like, Edward, for example, can't die for a long time, so kind of a funky game. But anyways, yeah, let's jump right into it. I want to make this at least relatively brief, plus my other tier lists. So I've made kind of a meme tier up here, SS, and I've decided to put Iliana in it. So the reason for this is that Iliana has a very specific purpose in the game. And as an actual unit, she's actually insane because she's the only one that can accomplish what she needs to accomplish, and it's really useful for the actual game. But for the purposes of the Dawn Brigade, she's not great. So, okay, let's talk about her as a character in the Dawn Brigade. You only get her for the first part of the game. She comes fairly early and actually can offer some pretty decent combat. She's frail, but she can actually double, I think, right away, although that'll stop pretty fast. And she hits fairly hard because she's a mage. So, decent unit, but probably would be something like C tier. The reason that she's so unique is because she's your only bridge between the Dawn Brigade and the Part 3 Grail Mercenaries. And there are some things, specifically in the form of money and skills, that are way more useful on the Mercenaries than it is on the Dawn Brigade. Because the Dawn Brigade, as I said, only has 3 chapters during Part 3, whereas the Mercenaries, you get to use those characters a lot. So a skill like Paragon, for example, that doubles experience, way more useful on the Mercenaries. A skill like Celerity, and this is going to be really important, but the Dawn Brigade chapters in Part 3 are basically all defend chapters. So a skill like Celerity that gives +2 movement, not that useful. Also, money is way more useful on the Mercenaries. The point is she's the only one that can actually accomplish these things. So she's amazing. But yeah, I guess she'd be in C tier, but she's such a unique character that I decided to put her in her own little tier. Okay, so let's start the actual tier list. So if you've seen my tier list ever, you know for a fact that I absolutely love Jaggins. And the Jaggin for this game, or at least this part, is absolutely Soth. So Soth comes as a promoted unit. He's a rogue, kind of a unique class for a Jaggin. I will say that he does get hindered a bit by his class, which is unfortunate. He can use daggers and knives, which are really just weaker than every other weapon in the game, which is unfortunate. It is cool that he gets ranged with the knives, but yeah, it's not great. As far as his stats are concerned, he is awesome though. He has enough bulk to basically be invincible or close to in Part 1, doubles everything, hits pretty hard even though those knives and daggers do kind of suck. In Part 2, he can still hold his own. He can use the Beast Killer, which is actually really nice because Beast Foe is a really nice skill that you want to keep on the Dawn Brigade. It gives you bonus damage against Lagoos. 2 of the Part 3 chapters are Lagoos, basically only chapters. But he doesn't need that. He can use the Beast Killer, which is really nice. He also starts with full support with Makaya, which is kind of nice. It even gives, I think, 2 attack, although no defense, which is unfortunate. But the attack is really nice, especially early on in the game. Because, you know, as I said, knives and daggers do kind of suck. But yeah, holds his own in Part 1, and is still a useful character in Part 2. Maybe not the best, but yeah, awesome character. Next up, we have probably my favorite character throughout the Dawn Brigade chapters because he's just so darn good, and that is Nolan. I love Nolan. Um, I'll probably talk about this a little bit more later, but I love bulk in this game, especially when it comes to the Dawn Brigade, because again, those part 2 chapters are largely defense. On part 1, you really want bulk early. One of the things to know about this game is there's no weapon triangle, so it's really hard to get extra avoid when you're like taking on specific enemies. And biorhythm, if you know anything about biorhythm, it's basically this like sort of a mood of characters that fluctuates from like all the way bad to all the way good. Then there's good, bad, and then middle. And I believe it's like 5 avoid, 5 hits, something like that, per each stage that you go through. And you really have no control. There might be more control than I'm giving it credit, but I don't really know how you control this. The problem with this in the context of, let's say, dodge tanking or trying to utilize avoid is that, I mean, you can go like 20% difference in your avoid. You can be looking at these 30% that you feel fairly comfortable with dodging. Suddenly it becomes something like 50 or 60, and now it's not so comfortable. So I really like bulk for the Dawn Brigade. I think it's extremely important, and no one provides it early. I will say that even though he does offer early good bulk, he actually becomes more of an offense machine as you go, as his strength and speed growth are actually quite strong. And his defense and HP do kind of suffer. He still has quite good HP, and even though his defense isn't spectacular, he actually gets a unique weapon during part 2 called, I believe it's the Tarvos, that gives him +4 defense, so that does sort of make up for it. So yeah, I like him quite a bit. One more thing to mention, he can abuse Beast Foe. I mentioned Beast Foe earlier, basically just makes you effective against Laguz. With the crossbow that he can use, he becomes extremely effective against Laguz. You can pretty much one-shot Laguz with like the Tarvos, for example, so this isn't the most useful thing, but it is kind of cute and something he can do, and obviously it's at range, which is cool. Alright, next up we have a character, honestly maybe should be higher than Nolan, I don't know, but I really like this character too, and that's Volug. Volug's an interesting character. I'm not going to talk too much about Laguz in this game. I really don't like Laguz in this game. Unless you're a Lord that doesn't have to transform back, or some very specific Laguz, they just transform so fast back out of their Laguz form in this game. I don't like them very much. Volug, on the other hand, has a special skill called Half Shift that allows him to not get the full bonuses of transforming into a Laguz, but allows him to be transformed basically all the time, which is really nice. During part 1, Volug is really, really strong. He's got enough offensive stats to 1 round, or at least double basically everything, and like 50 HP. You just have to worry about fire tomes, but he's absolutely awesome. In part 2, the half shift does... It isn't as strong as it is in part 1, obviously. I think I keep saying part 2. If I say part 2, I mean part 3, so I apologize for that, because I'll probably say that a lot. So you can shift him normally, but as I said, I really don't like the way Laguz work, and that takes forever, and it's not the easiest thing to do. The half shift, however, is still quite strong in part 3. I do think that once you get there, he is worse than Nolan. He's recruited a bit later, and I think he's a bit worse than Nolan in part 3, which is why I have Nolan higher, because I think Nolan offensively is better, and his bulk will catch up to Volug. But I still really like Volug, and because Volug basically requires nothing of you, kind of like Soth, there is a chance that he should be higher than Nolan. I don't really know. I think these two are fairly interchangeable. But for me, these are the only 3 that belong in S. I think they're all amazing. Even if you don't train Nolan per se, he's still so good on like the chapter you get him, because that's before Soth. Even when Soth shows up in the next chapter, he's still incredibly important, and still offers that bulk. So I still really like him, even though you do sort of have to train him for him to still be good in part 2. Like these two. Okay, next up, moving now to A. I have Aeron. So Aeron may be a bit controversial, mostly because his bases aren't spectacular. And a lot of times in this game, I think bases are really important because it's sort of hard to gain levels. And obviously in general, I think bases are better than growth. But there's a few reasons that I think Aeron is so good. Number 1, even though they are growth, his growths in specific stats are so high that it's not as random as it may seem, or at least may be on some characters. He has a 70% growth in HP, strength, skill, and defense. Those are really, really high. I mean, we're talking about like 2 out of 3, even better than that. So you gain him 5 levels, and we're looking at something between 3 and 4 in those stats. And 5 levels isn't that hard to come by. So even though his base stats aren't spectacular, those are great. What I really like about Aeron is part 2, because what I'm really looking for in part 2 is just somebody else with some bulk that can actually sit there and take some hits, and sort of protect your weaker units. And I think that Aeron is basically the only other unit that can do it that isn't like these 3. And even these 3 are not going to be as bulky as him by the time you're getting to part 2. By the time he's promoting to a Halberdier, he'll likely have capped or close to capped strength, skill, and speed, and his HP will be quite good too. His speed does struggle a bit, and this doesn't really matter because I don't think doubling is that important. It is kind of a problem if it sort of lingers around like 15-ish, because he'll actually get doubled on the second Dawn Brigade chapter in part 3. But you can always speedwing him, and the other 2 chapters doesn't really matter because he'll pretty much always get doubled by the cats, but it won't matter, and he won't get doubled by the tigers. So that's why I like him so much. He's just like this rock that you can just place somewhere and kind of sit there and absorb hits, which I think in part 2 is so important. And he is useful in part 1, although not as offensively minded as a lot of the other units in the Dawn Brigade. Next up, I have Laura. I'll probably talk about this in another portion of this, but healers really aren't as important in this game as they are in some other Fire Emblem games, just because of how plentiful and how good things like vulneraries are. But she is still a healer, and even though they're not spectacular in this game, they are still good. So yeah, not much to talk about with her. She's got good magic for a healer, and she's incredibly frail, but yeah, healers are good. Next up, I have also maybe a controversial pick. I have Makaya. I really like Makaya. Some people, when I stream this game, I know have sort of critiqued her or said that she's not very good. I don't think she's amazing, obviously, but I think that Makaya offers a couple of sort of utility points or moments that I think make her a really solid unit, as opposed to basically every other unit in Dawn Brigade, obviously, that I have lower than her. I think number 1, Thani is absolutely amazing, and is perhaps underrated. The ability to just point and click on Cavs and Knights, especially in the first part of the game, is really, really powerful. I mean, you can certainly do it with other units, and you have like Sode and stuff, but he kind of struggles with his strength because the knives suck so much. And that point and click is just super, super useful. And that'll remain in part 2 as well. She does pretty good chip damage too, and she can heal in part 2 and can immediately use Physic, which is really nice. I mean, so can Laura, obviously, but 2 Physics are better than 1, and I think that utility is quite nice, even though, as I said, healing isn't quite as important as it is in perhaps other games. But yeah, I think this is enough utility. I mean, yes, she's incredibly frail. Yes, her speed sucks. I usually give her as many robes as I get and shields. So admittedly, that does sort of skew my perception of her a bit. Lords are really hard to rank, I find, because you usually want to give them extra stuff so they don't die, and then they can often seem stronger than they are. I think she would probably be lower if she wasn't the Lord and I wasn't giving her those extra things and extra levels. But I do think she offers a decent amount of utility, and obviously her availability is amazing. Also, little side note, healing, as I said, not the most useful thing in the world in this game, but healing allies in part 3, all 3 of the chapters that you do as the Dawn Brigade, you have allies, and a lot of times they'll run around like idiots looking to be healed if they don't have full health. So the ability to physic or just normal heal them with Makaya can actually get them back into the fight. So she can actually offer sort of offensive utility even without actually doing it herself, which I think is interesting. I mean, obviously Laura benefits from this too, but I was just thinking about that. I think that's actually kind of interesting. All right, next up I have all the way at the bottom, because his name starts with Z, it's Zahark. I don't like Zahark a ton. I think he's a solid unit. You get him sort of late in part 1. He is useful on those chapters, but as you're getting him, you're also getting chapters where you get to use like the Black Knight or Nyla or stuff like that, or Tormund, or things of that nature. So I don't think he's as useful as he may sort of appear. I also think he has some serious bulk issues with base 30 health and I think something like 11 or 12 defense. I don't know exactly what his defense is, but it's quite low. I do still think he offers you a solid body throughout part 2, and he's good in part 1, obviously. But I don't think he's as good as anyone that's above him. B is interesting because I think any of these could potentially be higher than Makaya, but I just wind up using Makaya a decent amount. So I do still think he offers the ability to like not just get one rounded by stuff at base, which is genuinely nice in part 2. I mean, it's nice to have that, but I don't think that he's spectacular. And then finally in B, I have a character who's incredibly strong, probably the strongest unit we've talked about, but also has basically the biggest availability issues of any of the characters we've talked about throughout the Dawn Brigade chapters. So Terrania is awesome. He comes as like a level 14 or 16, something like that, general. In part 1, he's essentially invincible. He kills everything, but you only get him on a couple of chapters. In part 2, you also only get him on 2 chapters, but he's really awesome on both those chapters. There's not a ton to say about him. I mean, by the time you're on part 2, characters like Aeron and Nolan probably won't be that far away from him. You can Master Crown him for the 3rd chapter, which is really nice. Actually, you can probably do it for the 2nd chapter too, which will give him a little boost. And he is really strong, but yeah, I think his availability is just pretty bad. But when you get him, he's quite good. So, okay, next up I have kind of a weird choice. I have the Black Knight. I think the Black Knight actually offers a decent amount of utility throughout the Dawn Brigade chapters. There's a decent amount of the Black Knight-esque units, and they're going to be in C as well, that are super busted, but you only get for like a chapter or 2. I am discounting the chapter where the Black Knight defends Makaya, because if you include that chapter, he should be with Iliana and Double S, because without him, the game would actually be impossible. But I think even without that chapter, he's pretty useful. You get him on a couple of chapters in part 1, and he can basically solo them. The reason that I have him at the top of C is because the first chapter in part 3 is actually pretty difficult, and once he comes, even though he doesn't come until a little bit into the chapter, he can actually completely solo aside and really accelerate the finishing of that chapter. And for me, as I said, I think that chapter gives me a lot of headaches. So should he be at the top of C? I don't know. Everything from here on out is just going to be kind of whatever, but I like him. I think he's useful in that chapter. Next up I have Jill. I don't really know how the community, I guess, feels about Jill. I've had people tell me that she's really good, or that they think she's really good, or that other people think she's really good. I don't get it. I think Jill is like really bad. There's a bunch of reasons for this. Her availability isn't spectacular. You get her the same as like Azarkatan stuff, but sort of like Terrania, you don't get her on some of the chapters in the first part. If you got her on the Swamp chapter, it'd actually be pretty nice, but you don't. I also think that most of the Dawn Brigade chapters after you recruit her are not particularly conducive to who she is. She has really good movement, but that's hindered by being inside, which a few of the chapters are. And then in part 3, it's basically all defend chapters, so I don't know what you're doing with her that's useful, which is again why I like Aeron so much, because you don't have to go move everywhere or kill a million enemies. So all those, I think, mean that even though she's a really good class, it's not utilized by the Dawn Brigade. But the big reason I don't like her, she's 24 base health, man. It's terrible. You can Master Seal her immediately, and I suppose she can be okay, but her base stats are just not good. Her defense is okay, but her HP is terrible. She doesn't hit that hard, gets weighed down by stuff, and her speed isn't that good. Yes, her growths are good. Yes, she's a good class in a vacuum. But she's so frail. I think somebody told me once that you're supposed to like send her over to the mercenaries. I'm not even going to dignify that with a response because that's really dumb. But yeah, no, I think she's terrible. I have her this high because, she can offer immediate combat that's a little bit better than I think the rest of the units. She does have some utility with her class, but I don't like her very much. Next up I have... should be in E, I can't see him. Oh, here he is, Edward. Not in B. I mentioned earlier why I don't think dodge tanking is particularly good, and I'll echo those sentiments. Edward's just really frail. I will say that he should maybe be a bit higher because he is so useful on the first couple of chapters, but he falls off so fast. I mean, basically on chapter 1 he's already just useless, like Nolan's way better. If you do get a couple of speed early, he can consistently double, which allows him to give a little bit of offense, but yeah, I don't think he's very good. And his bulk is terrible. I don't think that you should train him. If you do put the investment in him that I would be putting in, let's say, Aeron, he would probably be a decent character, but I don't think he'll be anywhere near as good as Aeron, again, just because of that bulk. So I don't like him a ton. Next up we have Leonardo. Right here. I will say both Leonardo and Edward, just like the Tarvos that I mentioned that Nolan gets, do get their own unique weapons. I don't think they're as good as the Tarvos because that defense is really useful. But I will say that base level Leonardo with his bow can actually like one-shot or close to one-shot Falcon Knights on the second chapter of Part 3. Which is kind of ridiculous, but it doesn't really make him a good unit. I don't really have to say much beyond he's a starting archer. There is an archer in this game that is ridiculous, but it's everything to do with his stats and not really anything to do with how good bows are in this game. He's just not very good. So yeah, I have him in C. Next up, we're going to be putting Torments Crew. So Torments Crew has maybe the biggest availability issue of any characters in the entire game. It doesn't really matter for our purposes because all we really care about is that you get him for some of Part 1 and then don't get him again. But these three get really hindered by availability because you don't actually get them again until Part 4, and they've completely fallen off except for kind of Merim. As far as how they are in Part 1, they're all really good. Merim's basically invincible. Torment can like one-round people, and Vic is really useful in the Swamp chapter. So yeah, they're like promoted or strong reviews. I'm not going to talk a ton about them. I think they're all quite strong, but their availability is quite bad. And the portion that you get them for Part 1, similar to the next characters I'm going to be talking about, not where you really need strong characters. So next up we have Raphael and Nyla. Nyla's one of the Lagoon Lords. She's essentially invincible and can kill everything. And then Raphael's a Aeron, so a dancer. Obviously they're both insane, but their availability is quite low, so I have them at the bottom of C. You can play around with these, specific rankings all you want. Maybe they should be in D if you feel differently about that, but yeah, they're strong when you get them, but you don't get them very much. Alright, and then finally we're going to have, which I could make an F tier, but these units are basically useless, and that is Fiona and Meg. I'm not going to talk too much about these two, because there's really not much to say. Fiona also has a class kind of like Jill that just isn't conducive to the Dawn Brigade chapters, but it wouldn't really matter because her base stats are just terrible. Yeah, not much to say. And then Meg as well just has awful base stats and is a terrible character. If she was more of a traditional knight and had slightly better bases, I might like her because she'd be fairly similar to Aeron, but she's not, so she's just terrible. Yeah, I don't think there's much controversy with these two. They are absolutely useless. So yeah, so that's my tier list. Obviously, even amongst, just looking at the first part of the game, because some of these availabilities are different, losing them after Part 1 or whatever, it is still difficult. Obviously, Nyla as a character is leagues above all these other characters, but for the purposes of the Dawn Brigade, I don't think it's that strong. So, as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you hate this tier list, if you love it, feel free to comment below. I'm always interested in what sort of the community thinks. If I'm wrong, if I'm right. I have played this game a handful of times, mostly because I fail a lot on the Dawn Brigade because I hate them. So I feel like I'm fairly familiar with at least this portion of the game. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, as always. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.